Okay, so this is the second funniest joke in the world, according to the website Chortle. A woman gets onto a bus with her baby, and the bus driver says, "Oh my God, that's the ugliest baby I've ever seen." And she bursts into tears, and she makes her way down to the end of the bus, and she sits next to this little old man. And the little old man says, "What's the matter, love?" And she goes, that bus driver just told me that my baby is the ugliest baby, he's ever seen." And the man gets just fuming, gets really irate and says, "That's terrible. That's terrible. You should go up and tell that bus driver off. And here, I'll hold your monkey for you." So what's happening in that joke is we start on one trajectory on the notion that, because we've all heard stories, we know where this is going, we're dealing with an evil bus driver. So we're going up on that path, evil bus driver, kind of nasty, we're moving along, we know stories, Then suddenly we're greeted with this second kind of line, this second idea, and it's kind of the more taboo notion of a profoundly ugly baby. And we make that connection. It pops, it snaps. We get an endorphin rush, we make that connection. That endorphin rush is really profound. It actually goes through our bodies and it needs to escape. It comes out of our mouths. We laugh. Jokes are the best example of what an idea is. And that's the power of ideas, and ideas are the bedrock of creativity. It's just connecting things. It's new relationships. And ideas are basically the closest thing we have to tangible magic in this world. There's a wonderful quote, I'm sure many of us have read *Sapiens* by Noah Yuval Harari, and he talks about how we are this remarkable species that can literally just make up conceptual things and universally agree to them. Religion, marriage, money, time, they're all just concepts. They're all things that we've actually just decided to agree on. And we can make perceived value. We can literally kind of make things up and allow people to believe in it, because all we're doing is connecting dots. Now, Steve Jobs put it this way. I like this quote board. This took me a while to find. It's really grainy. I think I've downloaded this and used this in talks for almost, probably since 1995, to be honest, just to date myself. So Steve Jobs put it this way. So creativity is just connecting things. So when you ask creative people how they did something, they just feel a little bit guilty because they didn't really do it. They just saw something and it seemed obvious to them after a while. And that's because they had this ability to synthesize new things. And unfortunately, that's too rare a commodity in these days, because many of us don't have a broad perspective into our problems. We don't have enough broader experiences and dots to connect to come up with original ideas, because originality is important. The distance between an evil bus driver and a profoundly ugly baby is originality. And that's its importance. It's the distance between the dots that we're connecting that creates originality. And originality is an enticing thing that makes people sort of listen to stories and lean in. I spend a lot of my time teaching creativity, which sounds kind of really bizarre. I mean, teaching creativity, it sounds like, teaching people to dance to architecture. It's kind of ridiculous. It seems like it's something that's not even possible to do. But that's what I attempt to do. And this comes from the fact that I have been around lots of different creative people in lots of different disciplines, in lots of different projects over the past 20 or so years. And one of, the most helpful things that I teach people from the get-go, especially those who are sort of entering into kind of creative practice in a work context, is that you don't think ideas, you recognise them. This is profoundly important. There's this notion that our ideas are this individualistic sort of work of genius. That simply isn't true. One of the best examples of the fact that we don't think ideas, we recognise them, comes from the fact that many of us have the same ideas at the same time when we're given the same brief. This happens often, and we often accuse people of sort of stealing our ideas, but it's because we're always drawing from the same dots and sources. The best example of this is this: the cartoon character Dennis the Menace. In 1951, Dennis the Menace was invented by a cartoonist in the UK, and a cartoonist in the USA and published 5 days apart. And those two cartoonists had no connection to each other whatsoever. And it's known as the Dennis the Menace coincidence, and it's published and usually used as an example of plagiarism in plagiarism cases to sort of show the fact that these random events can occur. But this isn't a coincidence. I think you hear this story that this thing was literally invented by two different cartoonists at the same time, and we feel a little bit kind of eerie about it. It feels like the Mandela effect. It feels like there's some sort of glitch in the matrix when these profound coincidences happen. But if you hark back to what's going on in 1951, it's not such a crazy notion that two people came up with this idea for a cartoon character. For those who don't know, the character of Dennis the Menace, which is they look identical, they got stripy shirts, they also had very similar characteristics. They were basically mischievous young boys. And in 1951, that makes a lot of sense because they are representing the first babies born of the baby boomer generation, these post-war children. So think back to that time. If you're in 1951 and you've settled, it's peacetime in the UK, it's peacetime in the USA, that idea of a mischievous, carefree child is an incredibly enticing sort of possibility. Another thing is the fact that at that time as well, the Cold War was just kicking off. The fear of the USSR, the Soviet Union bombing, but not only kind of getting into kind of war with the USA and the UK, but also the idea of communism kind of infiltrating the society. And that was known as the Red Menace. It was written up in books. It was in newspaper headlines. There was a movie at the time called The Red Menace. So it was in the culture, the title. And also, just to top that off, the name Dennis was the 17th most popular boy's name in 1951. And right now it's sitting at a bit of kind of a dwindling kind of around 600. So if you want to be original, instead of, calling your child Apple, call them Dennis. So where this comes from is dots. Again, we need better ways to come up with better and more original ideas by cultivating where we get our dots from. It's essential. It's important. This is a cigarette lighter. It's also a AA battery with a little bit of wire, a little bit of exposed bit at the end. You connect the circuit, you spark up your cigarette. This is a toaster oven. It's also metal slats ripped off a bed, cords from an old kettle that has been pulled out and those wires exposed and then wrapped around the metal to kind of create the heat, creating a conductive surface. You stick your bread in there and you get a warm, comforting bit of toast. Now, these are inventions from a German prison. And a German prison is a great place for innovation to happen. It has all the things that innovation needs. It has scarcity. You have scant resources. There is no other option. If you want a warm piece of comforting toast, or if you want to light your cigarette after lockdown, you need to get creative. And when that sort of creates this urgency, you need to take risks. I mean, not only do you need to kind of rip the wires out of the kettle when the guards aren't kind of looking and then come back to your cell and kind of wrap that together, you need to risk electrocution just to get a piece of toast. So what happens when you are in a German prison and you need things and you're forced to be inventive is you need to shift your perspective about what things are. So what is a toaster oven? It is basically heat and wire and electricity rolling through conductive materials, creating filaments that create heat. When you're inside a German prison, everything looks like Lego. Everything looks like Lego, and we've forgotten that. We have forgotten the fundamental building blocks of what ideas are, what things are kind of made of and what their functional potential is. And I think that's for a few reasons. When we think about this, all the platforms we use nowadays are incredibly locked down. There's so many rules about what you can and can't do. And what disappoints me is that we're losing our ability to kind of look deeper into the functional potential of things that are around us. This is the internet, all 11 million pages of it. Now, this is the opposite of a German prison. There are so many kind of choices here. When we are greeted with a brief or a task, we have so many different ways and options to kind of solve this. And that's really, really kind of overwhelming. And I think what we're suffering, especially as creative people at the moment, is we're suffering from a scarcity of scarcity. We almost have too many choices, or at least too many vast choices. We're looking out into the ether to kind of sort of solve problems sometimes, when sometimes the solution is actually a little bit kind of closer to the problem itself. And we just need to be resourceful and reframe what we're looking at. And to do that, we need to adopt the lost art of hacking, not hacking into kind of secure kind of places, but the idea of hacking, pulling things apart and then seeing their potential and putting them back together again, and being a bit subversive with the platforms we work on. Here's a few examples of some great platform hacks of platforms that we use every day that happened in their early inception. This one, an American band called Wolfpack, in the early days of Spotify, they created an album called the Sleepify album. It was 30 minutes of silence. They got everyone they knew to play it non-stop for 40 days. And they made $20,000 so their band could tour. Spotify, it was well PR'd, and Spotify said, yeah, that's great. That's really creative. It's a really creative use of our platform. And then quickly kind of shut down the potential of doing that ever again. When Hurricane Sandy occurred, a group called Occupy Sandy in Brooklyn, saw there were a bunch of people who were displaced and had all their possessions kind of ruined, and they had really, really specific needs. They also noticed there was the whole of America was looking on live at this natural disaster, wanting to help. So they created an aid mechanism. They created a wedding registry on Amazon. All the people that needed things became brides and grooms, and all the people who wanted to share things became guests of a wedding. And $250,000 worth of goods were passed on to people they need. Because what is Amazon? If you look at it in the right way, it's an aid delivery mechanism, especially if the urgency is there and the need is there. My favourite example of how we've lost touch with things in terms of their functionality is this. It's called the Toaster Project. It's done by an artist, a UK artist called Thomas Thwaites. He went to his local supermarket and bought a toaster for £4 and then thought to himself, how on earth can that cost £4? And so he went about to try and make his own toaster, and you can see it there. And when I say make his own toaster, he wanted to make a toaster from scratch. He went to a mine and found the elemental materials and smelted the wires. He found out the mainstream sort of plastics that, that major kind of cheap consumer products used, and went to companies and they told him, we can't tell you how we make our plastics. It's highly patented and it's also highly dangerous. And he went and found them anyway and got himself put on watch lists for grabbing chemicals and making things in his garage. And he made plastic from scratch. He made the plastic in a microwave and pieced together his own toaster. It cost him £22,000 and 6 months, but he did it. And it just goes to show how disconnected we are to how things actually work. And we need to kind of make our own scarcity, because some dots are more valuable than others, and we need to isolate those valuable dots when we are coming up with broader solutions. I've had an interesting kind of creative career where I've actually kind of bisected the world of design thinking and UX and the world of brand storytelling. And this is an observation that's actually led to me kind of, I guess, devising a sort of a complementary kind of method that sort of educates both sides of the fence in different schools of thought. And this is that design thinking and UX, it has strategy. It's highly strategic and researched. It has precision. It's usually about an experience that's sort of studied and iterated and moves forward, but it lacks imagination. Whereas brand storytelling or agency storytelling has strategy, it's usually researched. It lacks precision because often the executions sort of don't take into account the platform it's existing on, which could be media, it could be other things like that, but it is full of imagination. Now, I think both methodologies are a little bit broken. For instance, design thinking sometimes gets so lost in UX, gets so lost in the logic that imagination is lost, and brand storytelling has leaps of imagination that struggle to land on the platform. So I think we need to think of better methods. And I've been working on this since the start of my creative career. And I've been devising different ways that bring people into the creative process for their insights earlier. And that involves thinking about the triggers, which are the cultural tensions that divide and unite, the external factors that change behaviour, teaming and leveraging partners, and what I call tools and totems, which are the useful symbols in tech and utility. Again, these are how I collect the dots around a problem. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about tools and totems. Particularly, totems are what I call the tattoos you can't remove. They're the things about your brand and your organisation. They're what people say about you when you're not in the room and the things you own up and need to admit to. Tools are the technology that you're using. And I love this analogy, and I've always been interested in this, which is Nintendo's philosophy of lateral thinking with withered technology. Lateral thinking with withered technology brought us the Game Boy. Junpei, the design leader of Nintendo at the time, was building the games device, and it was built out of really, really simple, almost rudimentary, antiquated, calculated technology. There was better technology out there. They could have made it colour. They could have made it far more sort of spec'd, but he didn't do that. He used the technology that was really studied and understood and allowed lots more people to kind of create software for it rapidly. And that attributes the success of the Game Boy, not Tetris, which Netflix has sort of convinced us is so about a month ago. So I found that that's kind of thinking incredibly inspiring and inspired me to do this project. Okay, here's a test. Okay, here we go.
So look, there's Millie.
Sorry, I'll stop looking at you.
That works. That was an app called Look Birdie that I made about 8 years ago when my kids were young. What it was basically just a photo app that made bird noises and made kids look at the camera. And all I did was just take the functionality of the iPhone and use it not for its purpose. I used the flash interactor, it was flashing, I made the speaker make bird noises, and I just used the basic sort of functionality of the flash. And it made the kids look, and its novelty and its different combination made people download it. And it also worked on dogs, and I sold it to a dog food company. At my time at Clemenger, where I was a creative director for many years, we had the client Maya, and Christmas was coming up. So we were looking for, I guess, a novel solution for them. And we ended up with a concept. We thought, well, let's use sound and let's work around that to see if we can create a brand experience. And we ended up with this called Wonderful Hold Music. So if you rang at Christmas time to Maya Melbourne, you received an answering scene message. It said, your call is important to us, but it's also important to children affected by domestic violence, because the longer you stay on the line, you're raising a donation for families affected by violence for the Salvation Army. Thank you for your patience. We'll be with you shortly. Because just right at that time, Spotify and the concept of time and money was a concept we were sort of understanding. So all we did was we took the music off the Christmas CD, which had a charitable donation part, take the donation part, place that inside a small programmatic device that would sort of tick it up. And we created this interaction you had with hold music that made you stay online, and people did. They stayed online 40% longer. Again, really wacky conversation to have with the guy who sort of ran the SIS system of the phones to say, what do you want to do? Yeah, we want to do that. We want to put this thing in there. That was an interesting conversation, but we did it and it worked. And again, an interesting idea of shifting around the value to kind of create an interaction that turned frustration into philanthropy. So I guess what this brings us to is when you think in that way, when you break down things to the sum of their parts and you isolate the value of different things, what you're doing is you're baking simplicity, feasibility, and engagement into your solutions. You're taking the best of the UX and design thinking approach and the best of the novel aspects of agency storytelling and branded approaches. And I guess in doing this, and my goal in how I teach this, and in the workshop, hopefully I'll meet some of you tomorrow and we'll tackle a live brief, is going towards the notion that creativity isn't risk, it's resourcefulness. If you break down the elements of the parts of the problem and they're there, and that's what you've solved out of, you always have those elements of the parts. So when things go inevitably wrong, You have this broad, zoomed out perspective on the problem, and you can also sort of find the solution. Creativity isn't risk, it's resourcefulness. And I think the most powerful thing we can do as creatives, and something that we've forgotten to do, is to see the value others can't. And if we do so, we'll always be valuable. Thank you.